Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Mark Joseph Stern, a writer for Slate Magazine.
And we're talking today because you and I got into it online about a controversy out of New Mexico. And there was this photographer who she does weddings with her husband. They have a two-person, I don't know if it's a single proprietorship or a business or whatever, but they do all kinds of photography, including weddings. And a lesbian couple came to them and emailed actually and said, "We want you to do our wedding." And they basically replied, "We actually don't do same-sex weddings." I wrote a piece about this where I have their actual email back and forth on the page, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was basically, "We don't do same-sex weddings, but thanks for looking us up." And there was another kind of back and forth, and this ended up being brought before the New Mexico Human Rights Commission, and it was found that the photographer was guilty of discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and was fined some amount of money, I think, to cover the legal fees of the plaintiff, I guess, in this case. And then this went all the way up to the New Mexico Supreme Court, and they said, yeah, that's basically right. This law was violated, and now there's been a petition to take this possibly to the Supreme Court. So there's kind of a lot to talk about here, and I thought that maybe one way we could go about it is first we could talk about this individual case in our argument in our two pieces, yours at Slate and mine at The Atlantic, and then maybe after that we could just talk more generally about non-discrimination law and freedom of expression and all the different kind of issues that are in tension here. So I guess why don't you lay out your piece that you wrote at Slate, and then I can kind of say how I responded to it. Maybe that's the best way to get started.
Certainly. So I wrote a piece that was actually a response to Ross Douthat's piece in the New York Times. Douthat's piece was called "The Terms of Our Surrender." And it was basically an argument that, okay, the gay marriage fight is basically over. I'll accept it. Gay marriage is here to stay. The Supreme Court will soon legalize it all throughout the country. And so now it's time for conservatives, religious conservatives, to sort of bargain for what they'll be able to keep, in the sense of how they'll still be able to disagree with, I suppose, sort of the idea that homosexuality is okay. And what Douthat basically said was, liberals are not giving us anything. Liberals have decided, as these cases, as the photography case in particular proves, liberals are saying, no conservatives, no Christians, you must completely accept everything that we say. You are all bigots if you do not. We have won and you have lost. So I took a few issues with Douthat's reasoning, and my main problem was that he doesn't really explain why requiring non-discrimination against gay people, as a state like New Mexico does, why saying, okay, listen, if you businesses are going to open yourself up to the public, then you have to open yourself up to all of the public, and you're not allowed to take a certain class of people, like gay people, and say, no, we won't serve you. I don't think that Douthat explains why that is different in kind from non-discrimination laws against black people, non-discrimination laws against women, non-discrimination laws against Jews. And it seems to me that the same logic should apply, and I think I'm coming to the crux of our disagreement. It seems to me that if you discriminate against Jews, then you're an anti-Semite. If you discriminate against black people, then you're a racist. And if you discriminate against gay people by refusing to serve them, that you are a homophobe. So that was sort of my argument in broad strokes.
Okay. And I guess I took two issues with your piece. And one of them was you basically argued in your piece that Ross Douthat was somehow being disingenuous in the way that he was presenting this issue. And that was kind of my smaller disagreement. And my larger one was looking at this case of the New Mexico photographer and looking at this conflict that's come up between, I think that there was a gay wedding that wanted to procure the services of a baker who refused to make a cake for it. And then there's this photographer case, and there might have been one other one that I'm forgetting off the
There
top of
was
my
the
head.
florist. It's the
Right,
florist, the
right, of
baker,
course.
and the photographer. The
Right,
infamous
yes.
trio, as I call them.
Yes. Um, and so I haven't looked at the particulars of those two other cases, and I want to acknowledge up front that anti-gay animus both exists and could motivate people in situations like this. There could be, for all I know, this florist that I haven't read anything about is motivated by anti-gay bigotry, and we should all look at her actions or his actions and censure them and uh, say it's terrible, right? Um, but in the case of this photographer, and in some cases, the argument that I want to make is that refusing to photograph a gay wedding, as this photographer did, is not necessarily a sign of homophobia, of hatred of gays, of bigotry. I think that those were the three terms that you kind of used talking about these three cases generally. And I think that if we look at the case of the photographer in particular, where we have this statement that she made, kind of laying out, this is her petition to the Supreme Court, laying out why she thinks that she has been wronged in this case. She basically said, look, I am a religious Christian, and I have certain beliefs about what marriage is. It is not my business practice to discriminate against gay people generally. I'm happy to take on gay clients if they come in and want to have their professional headshots taken, if they come in and want to have a portrait taken in their home, whatever. It's gay weddings in particular that I don't want to photograph, because I believe that, her belief is that marriage is a religious sacrament that is inherently procreative in nature. It's, laid out in the Bible. This is what marriage is. She doesn't believe that what gay people are doing is getting married, and so she doesn't want to participate in something that she doesn't believe in. And to me, that is distinguishable pretty easily from discriminating against gay people, right? And I don't want to say that there's no relationship at all in between these two. I don't think it's easy to kind of neatly separate them. But when you have someone who has refused other business because of religious reasons, it mentions in her petition, for example, that there was someone who wanted to take nude maternity photos, and that she rejected this. And I don't really understand what the Christian religious objection is to nude maternity photos. And in the same way, I don't understand. I would argue, and I have argued in the Atlantic, that this photographer should, in fact, take pictures of gay weddings, because even if you are a religious Christian who believes that marriage is procreative, there's a lot to celebrate in gay weddings, and you don't have to believe in everything that you photograph. And I kind of lay out why I think that religious Christians should, in fact, photograph these kinds of things. But the narrow point that I wanted to make in my piece, and that I thought your piece got wrong, was I don't think that we can conclude that in every instance it's necessarily motivated by hatred or bigotry or homophobia.
I should add before I start that another great reason to photograph gay weddings is that they're often fabulous.
Yes.
Far more fabulous than your, garden variety wedding. So they're really losing out on a lot of great business there. So to address your first point about me calling Ross Douthat's piece disingenuous, I think it was right there in the headline, so I should own up to it. I felt that there were two moves he made, two arguments that didn't really work for me. The first was he called refusing service to gay couples dissent. That was the term he used. He used it several times. That was hollow to me. I'm not certain how refusing to serve gay couples is really an act of dissent to be distinguished from an act of discrimination. I mean, certainly you're dissenting by refusing to serve gay people, but the way that Douthat phrased it made it seem like a very broad notion of, just almost political dissent, that by mandating that a photographer serve a gay couple, that was crushing this photographer's ability to dissent. I didn't see that really fleshed out. I didn't see more of an argument supporting it. And so I thought that without any of that, it seemed a bit like a code word, or perhaps a euphemism for what was really just discrimination. My second problem with Douthit's piece is that he continuously, he several times said that the Bob Jones case, which is a famous case where Bob Jones University was stripped from its tax-exempt status because it was refusing to allow interracial couples on campus and into its program. He kept attempting to differentiate that from what's going on here. He kept attempting to say that discrimination against interracial couples, discrimination against black people in general, is somehow different, very different in kind from discrimination against gay people. He took that as a presumption. And he never explained why it was a presumption. I was very concerned with that. It seems to me that the presumption there is that the Bible dislikes gay people more than it dislikes black people. Perhaps that's one explanation. Perhaps there are others, but without Douthit actually telling us why a university discriminating against interracial couples is so different from a business discriminating against gay couples, I was sort of perplexed by that point. So as to your point about my article, I will say, and I did say in my response to your response to my response to Douthit's response, I love how this is getting. I do regret using the term hate. And I don't think that hate in the basic definition of, I really loathe you, gay people. I don't think that that's the right word. You just used the much better word, which is animus. Animus is, of course, the word that our Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy always uses when describing discrimination against gay people. And it's a great word because it encompasses such a broad array of sort of feelings toward gay people. It doesn't just have to be hatred. It can be ill will. It can even be, sort of uneasy feeling around gay people. But I think that that's all encompassed by animus. And I do argue that if a photographer refuses to serve a gay wedding, that must on some level be motivated by animus toward gay people, whether it's a queasy feeling about gay marriage or a raw hatred about gay marriage. And I agree that this photographer did not exhibit a raw hatred. It was much more on the queasy side of the spectrum. That must be motivated somehow by some kind of animus against gay people.
Okay, well, so just real quickly on Douthit, because I don't have his piece in front of me, I don't want to get too much deeper into the weeds about it. I only read it twice, and that's been a while. I would just say, as a general proposition, as someone who argues against Ross quite a bit, being a libertarian, and he's a social conservative, and we have kind of interacted online for a long time. And as a kind of libertarianist person, and he's definitely not that, I have always found him to be very fair-minded and earnest in his arguments. And I would just sort of let that go at that, and people can read your piece and read Ross's piece and read my piece, and they'll all be linked on the side and draw their own conclusions. But to get into this deeper issue about whether animus is at play, I would say that, again, animus often is at play when gay people are discriminated against in any way, and I would also say that animus, there are these occasions, right, when people wouldn't themselves say or believe that they have animus, but in fact they do. And I can think of plenty of conversations, because I've been debating gay marriage for years and years, both online and with religious people, just in my personal life, just having debates around whether it be, the dinner table or at a friend's house or whatever. You do get the feeling talking to people sometimes, and they're like, hey, I have nothing against gays, but blah, blah, blah. And you kind of are suspicious, because they do seem to talk about the issue in a way where they seem to implicitly think that there's something creepy about it, right?
Right.
I would just say I've also had conversations with religious people where I don't get that feeling from them at all. Some of them knowing them quite well. And not only do I not get that feeling, I don't want to just base it on kind of intuition. I also think that there is an intellectually solid case that there are reasons apart from animus to behave in this particular way where you don't want to participate in gay weddings. And the clearest way that I can explain it to you is having known my fair share of Orthodox Catholic people. I went to Catholic school for 14 years, and I'm very much the kind of failed Catholic who went to Catholic school for 14 years, and that was like an indoctrination into not be Catholic. But you know, at the same time, I've met a lot of wonderful people who are very sincere in their convictions. And I've known some of these people, you know, everyone has a kind of different, every religious person has a different notion of how they're going to interact in a secular society, right? You have people on the far left wing of Christianity who look at Jesus' teachings and come away with a very radical communitarian notion that all excess private wealth is wrong and immoral, and that you know, a rich man has a very hard time getting into heaven, and they make their way around lots of people in the wealthiest country on earth, right? You have other people on the far right wing of Christianity who have various views about what kind of how much freedom people should have to educate their children in any way that they want, or the sexual teachings of Catholicism or of Christianity if they're not Catholic, right? And these people are all grappling with kind of what does it mean, and secular people grapple with this too, what does it mean to have my set of beliefs, what I believe to be right, and also to live in a society of laws and customs and social norms, and how do I juggle those things? You know, you kind of see the same tension when it comes to war, and people who are pacifists or people who have religious objections to war, and like what do they have to do? What makes them complicit in this greater evil that they think is going on, right? Or this greater sin, or this greater thing that they think is contrary to their religion. Okay, so I've known a lot of Orthodox Christians who really grapple with this when it comes to the issue of weddings, and not just gay weddings. They'll have friends who are getting married who are Catholic but are not getting married inside the Catholic Church, like inside the physical church, or a priest is not presiding over it. They don't regard it as the sacrament of marriage. And they, you know, a small percentage of Catholics don't think that this is right and won't attend those kinds of weddings. I have a hard time, or, you know, a second marriage. Some Catholics don't think that that divorce and second marriage is a thing unless the first marriage has been technically annulled by the church. And so they won't attend the second marriage of someone because they think that it is sinful. And thinking that it's sinful, I think can be distinguished between finding it, having animus against it, against the people doing it, if that makes sense. So when you look at a Catholic, an Orthodox Catholic who refuses to attend someone's second wedding, or who refuses to attend the wedding of someone that is not being conducted in a church and presided over by a priest, and including the sacrament of the Eucharist, and so it's not a do you think that they have animus toward the people engaged in those ceremonies because they're not refusing to attend?
Well, I think that the problem here is a difference between a class of people and people who are engaged in a certain activity, which has always been sort of the classic distinction for homosexuality for gay people. So it seems to me that if we accept that homosexuality is an identity, which, granted, many people do not. Justice Antonin Scalia does not. He thinks there are only homosexual acts, no homosexual people.
Right.
But if we accept, as I think both of us do, that you can be gay as an identity, then refusing to serve someone's gay wedding acts as a discrimination, to my mind, against the class of people, against the class of gay people, which is just different from refusing to serve or refusing to attend someone's second wedding, because that's based on that's based on a religious objection to what they've done. They've married someone, they've gotten divorced, they're getting remarried. Fair enough. But for a gay person, they're not really objecting, to my mind, and I know this is a very sort of fine-grained distinction, but it
Mhm.
harks back to your earlier point. I do think that refusing to serve a gay wedding is a kind of animus against gay people, and not just against the action of gay people getting married, because I don't think you can separate the two. They seem extremely intertwined to me. In the same way that refusing to serve an interracial wedding would strike
Mhm.
me as fundamentally racist, it seems to me that refusing to serve a gay wedding is fundamentally homophobic, or at least reveals anti-gay animus, because what you're objecting to is the act of two people of the same gender getting married. So I think that one sort of line in the sand that you can draw here, one dividing line,
Mhm.
is separating out gay people as a class, as a group of people who many states have decided deserve heightened protection from the law, and
Right.
anybody else. And that was what struck me as false about the photographer's claim, well, I don't shoot nude maternity pictures. Well, fine, fair enough. But what you're objecting to there is the nudity. Nude people are not a protected class of citizens. In New Mexico, gay people are a protected class of citizens, and so any
Yes.
kind of discrimination against them is subject to that kind of heightened legal scrutiny.
Yeah. So I agree with part of what you said. I agree that there's a way in which what the New Mexico photographer did is discriminatory against a class of people, right? Um, and there are, it's kind of a tricky case in some ways, but I ultimately think that that is valid, that it is discriminatory against a class of people. Uh, I think it's a separate question, right? Whether um, the fact that it's discriminatory against a class of people tells us nothing about the internal reasoning of the photographer. And I think that we could take those as separate questions. Is this discriminatory against a class of people? Does it have that effect? And on the other hand, what motivated the person who did this act to do it? So my piece was about that second question.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the crux of our disagreement is that to me, it's possible to take an action that discriminates against a class of people um, for lots of different kinds of internal motivations. You mentioned that you and I agree that gay people are a class of people in the sense that this is an orientation, that this is not a kind of choice that people make at some point, and they could just go to what do you call it, the religious therapist and just become ungay or something, right?
Right.
But perhaps the photographer wrongly has a different view of this, right? Believes that this is completely a choice, like other choices that she would regard as people just deciding to make, right? Uh, and in this case, she would be wrong, and I would argue, I would tell her, you're wrong about this. I would try to have other people not be wrong about this. I think it's an important point, but the reason that she was wrong would be ignorance about this point and not animus. You can also imagine a case, right, in which someone actually emotionally felt like I really don't feel like there's anything wrong with being gay, or I don't see why gays aren't allowed to be married. At the same time, I've been taught all my life to be obedient to my church, and my church tells me that I'm not allowed to participate in these gay weddings. And so my action in this case is motivated by obedience, not by any kind of animus. And I've certainly run across religious people who have had just these kinds of situations where what they kind of believe, their internal intuition, is different than what their church is telling them to do. And sometimes these people are obedient to their church. So I just think that, that there's all these kinds of different motivations that different people have. And I don't want to deny that animus is often a part of acts that are effectively discriminatory against gays. I just want to say that they're sometimes not the case, and we can see plausible instances where they're not the case, and we should recognize that, and we should recognize it for two reasons, right? One reason is out of fairness to the photographer in this case, right, who's been widely branded as hateful and bigoted, and to the extent that we can treat individuals fairly, we should. But the other thing is that we have a class of people who are affected by reports that other people hate them. And to the extent that we don't know that these people actually do hate them, we're causing them unnecessary harm by putting out these allegations, right? In the same way that every time you have like a fake hate crime, right? That the person who perpetrates these hoaxes, right, is hurting the very group that they're in their weird way purporting to help, because they're giving them the idea that there's more hatred in the world against them than there in fact is. So I think it's worth drawing this distinction, and it shouldn't, in the way that a lot of conservatives do. The point isn't that the people that sued the photographer are the real bigots, quote unquote. The point isn't that there's not anti-gay animus. The point isn't that there's no homophobia problem in Christianity. It's just that we should be careful about these individual cases and only make the claims that we can back up.
So just to backtrack a little bit, I think that you bring up two really great points, which are separate but related. And one of them is the legal issue, and one of them is the philosophical issue. And I think that I could see someone sort of meeting in the middle between both of our views. I can see someone believing that the photographers were not motivated by hate toward gay people, believing that the photographer, I guess just the one photographer, was not, deeply, deeply upset by the idea of gay people, did not hate gay people. But I could see this person also believing that the photographer should be legally required to photograph the gay wedding, because non-discrimination laws generally do not hinge on the question of whether the person doing the discrimination truly hates the person against whom she's discriminating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Non-discrimination laws turn on whether there was discrimination. And it doesn't matter if this discrimination was dressed up in all kinds of pretext, right? It doesn't matter whether this discrimination was done with exceeding courtesy. All that matters is whether discrimination existed. And so I would not mind if the entire world shared that view. I would be okay with that.
Okay.
Now, the issue of whether this person still has animus, I'm not certain whether it's mooted by my previous statement. I'm not certain whether it still matters if everybody agreed that anti-discrimination statutes for gay people are okay. To the extent that it's still a live issue, it seems to me that you can always sort of trace the root back to animus. It seems to me you've made a strong case of someone being sort of obedient, of someone just following the shepherd, and following the shepherd to the point of saying, I'm not comfortable with gay weddings, I won't photograph them. To my mind, even if that particular act itself does not scream animus, it can be traced only one step back to a root of animus, to a root of, in that respect, I think that's just sort of blatant homophobia. Often, if someone is being told in their congregation, homosexuality is sinful, gay people are sinful, you are not permitted to shoot their wedding. So if we're trying to sort of carve out a kind of forgiveness for people like this New Mexico photographer, I think I would be willing to say that her immediate act was not driven so much by animus, but by obedience to her church's animus. But I would still insist that, if I can hedge any more than that, I would still insist that her action is discriminatory, though. I mean, do you think that her action was discriminatory? Do we disagree on that point?
No, I agree. I agree that it's discriminatory, and actually, I want to just make one last point, and then I totally want to jump into this wider question of non-discrimination laws, because I absolutely agree with you that the internal motivations of people are not what non-discrimination cases turn on. So the one last point I wanted to make is that I would just say part of the difficulty in writing the pieces that I wrote on this subject and in talking about it with you is that a lot of my notion of what's motivating religious people, in this case, is just born of spending a ton of time around religious people and often often arguing with them and trying to figure out what it is that they think, and them trying to figure out what it is that we think, because I have all of these close relationships with people in this world, and really don't share a lot of their assumptions. And one thing that it took me a long time to kind of wrap my mind around is the sense in which some religious people, if they think that you're doing something sinful and they don't want to participate in it, their belief is basically that, like, by participating in it, by becoming complicit in this, and they really believe this, that they're doing you harm, that they are somehow assisting you in this thing that is going to jeopardize your immortal soul and consign you to a lifetime of hellfire. And this is their belief. They take it very seriously, and this is not all Christians, but there are Christians who, from a deep place of love and wanting to save you, will do all sorts of things that to the secular eye seems suspicious, annoying, judgmental, right? And it isn't always that. And I sometimes feel like, in the same way that I don't know if you followed that that Grantland piece that dealt with transgender issues.
Oh yes.
And a point that a lot of people raised about that, which I thought was a good one, was like, if you just had anyone who was transgender read this piece, right? If you just had anyone like that in your newsroom, you would have handled this a lot better. And I feel the same way about the way that Orthodox religious people are written about in the press, that these are people who are completely absent from most journalistic organizations and newsrooms and the social circles of most people writing. And, I don't think that that's because newsrooms have a widespread policy of discriminating against these people in hiring. It's a lot more complicated than that. Obviously journalists have to write about people that they're not around, and have to, can't always have someone of whatever, we write about all kinds of things. You can't have someone read it before all the time. But I do really think that experience with religious people, at least for me, has changed the way that my notion of what their motivations might be, in a way that, had I not spent really hours and hours and hours frustrated in arguing with people like this, and sometimes with hurt feelings or anger or whatever. So before I ramble on about that anymore, like I was saying before, you're absolutely right that anti-discrimination law doesn't turn on whether or not there is animus. And so that raises the question, what should it turn on? And just from what little you've said, my understanding is that your notion of how it should work is that there are some people who are protected classes, and that there are other classes of people who aren't. And if you're a protected class, then there should be heightened scrutiny, and something like the New Mexico photographer should get wrapped up in that, and there shouldn't be any discrimination allowed against that class. Is that basically accurate?
Sure. Put simpler, I would say that if you are a business who opens yourself up to the public, you are opening yourself up to all of the public, and you are not permitted to then pick and choose classes of people within the public against whom you may discriminate.
Okay, so there are a bunch of things I want to talk to you about.
We've got all the time in the world.
One is this thorny issue of separating. So like we were saying before, the photographer, right, says that, oh, well, actually, I do serve gay people. The doors of my business are open to gay people. It's just gay weddings that I object to. And I think we both agree. I think we have a little bit of a disagreement here, but I think we both agree that what she's doing is different than just closing her doors to gay people all the time. We can distinguish it from that. At the same time, I think we agree that at some level, it's hard to distinguish between discriminating against gay weddings and discriminating against gay people. There's overlap there that makes it difficult to completely disentangle them. And
yes.
So what I would ask you is, I would imagine, right, that your position isn't actually that she has to open the doors to all members of the public in the sense that she's compelled to photograph any kind of ceremony or any kind of event that any member of the public would come in and ask her to photograph. Is that right?
That's correct. She's permitted to say, I don't take nude pictures, I don't take violent pictures. She's not permitted to say, to my mind, I don't take pictures of interracial weddings because I don't think black people and white people should mix, something like that.
Okay, so what about what if she were targeting a class of people, right? And what she were saying is, I don't take pictures of, you know, uh, ceremonies commemorating official membership in the Ku Klux Klan, or I don't take pictures documenting someone's rise to operating thetan in the Church of Scientology because I have moral problems with the Church of Scientology or with the Nazi, or I'm sorry, with the Ku Klux Klan.
They're all the same. Yes, so I think that would be a kind of a content discrimination that she would have a much stronger case for. She would be able to say, look, I'm not discriminating against a class of people. I'm not saying, gay people, I believe that you're sinful and I'm not going to shoot your ceremony. What I'm discriminating against is the message contained in this fundamentally political event. I think the KKK is a political club, and I think that induction into it is a fundamentally political event, and I absolutely refuse to photograph it. The Scientology issue brings up a lot of really complicated church-state questions, but I think that depending on what the ceremony is, she could make a similar argument. And I think that unless you strongly assert that a gay marriage is a political statement, that by refusing to shoot a gay marriage, you are simply refusing to shoot, a political message rather than gay people's, pretty garden variety commitment of love, then that hypothetical falters.
And what about, and to kind of just press you a little bit more to try and figure out your beliefs, what about if it's, what if it's what if it's a gay photographer who objects to the theology of the Catholic Church, right? As I would argue, a gay photographer would be perfectly justified in objecting to that theology, and so a gay photographer refused to photograph a wedding of Orthodox Catholics.
So I think that is a little bit of an easier case and follows along the same lines that discrimination against a religious group on the face of it, just because you disagree with their religion, is probably a very suspect classification. And I think under the New Mexico Human Rights Act, which I've become intimately familiar with over the past few weeks, I think that they are a protected class, and so I do think that the photographer, the gay photographer traumatized by his Catholic schoolboy days, would probably have to go and shoot that wedding, and would not be able to assert, oh, I don't agree with Catholicism, I don't like Catholic doctrine, so I'm not going to shoot this Catholic wedding.
Right. Okay. So let me kind of lay out how I think that that non-discrimination law should work. And if people want to kind of read more about this, I recommend Julian Sanchez's piece on his blog that we'll also try and link in the sidebar. So one comparison that gets made a lot is when we're arguing about this is to the civil rights era and the non-discrimination laws that came up around Jim Crow, right? And this is, of course, a very thorny issue within like hard movement libertarianism, where, going back to like Rand Paul's appearance on the Rachel Maddow show and whether the Civil Rights Act should have been passed, whether it infringes upon private property, whether restaurants should be able to be forced to serve people, right? And Julian Sanchez actually also wrote a piece in Newsweek basically trying to persuade libertarians that we should be behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? As someone who's kind of like an independent that's libertarian leaning, maybe I'd get kicked out of like the hardcore libertarian circles because I absolutely think that that's right, and that lots of circumstances surrounding slavery and anti-black discrimination necessitated the strong steps that were taken by the government, and that the ability of blacks to participate as social equals in American society was kind of dependent on this. We weren't starting from kind of hour zero and trying to design a perfect society. We were reacting to centuries of enforced discrimination, and drastic steps were taken, right? Now, there are all kinds of groups aside from black people who are discriminated against in America. And I wouldn't make the statement that all of them, that American blacks are the only ones who deserve anti-discrimination protection, right? I think that anti-discrimination law beyond that is certainly justified. But I don't think that the particular post-Jim Crow framework is the best framework in every kind of situation. And what I ask myself when I think, should there be various non-discrimination protections in the law, is, first of all, is there in fact a significant problem that justifies the law and state coercion intruding into this area, right? And with gay rights and gay equality, certainly I think that gay marriage should be legal. Certainly I think that the state should view gays as completely equal under the law. And there are also lots of cases, right, where I would favor legal coercion to serve gays. If an ambulance driver didn't want to pick up gay patients, right, if the only pharmacy in a town didn't want to serve gay people, I can think of all sorts of situations where I would be willing to use legal coercion to enforce non-discrimination law on behalf of gays and lesbians. When it comes to the case of the photographer and the cake maker, I have a hard time seeing a sufficient problem to justify a legal framework in response to this. It seems to me that if what we're talking about is the particular thorny political issue, or maybe I should say politicized issue of gays in marriage, is it really a problem that rises to the level of non-discrimination law needing to be implemented and enforced for this particular narrow instance of gay people getting married and needing vendors to serve at their ceremonies, right? And a particular class of vendors that maybe we can get into a little bit more in a minute, but that kind of implicates the First Amendment in a way that makes me, that kind of like pushes me over the edge on this particular issue. So, and I've talked long enough, so let me jump in and respond and say what you will.
So the weakness that I find with that particular analog, with the argument from history that black people deserved civil rights protections in the 1960s because of the ubiquitous and insidious racism throughout U.S. history, in a way that gays today perhaps just don't. The problem with that is that sexual orientation is unlike race in the very notable way that it is not obvious. Some of us with good gaydar might like to believe it is, but, it's not always that simple to point at someone walking down the street and say that person is gay. In fact, the main way that you can divine whether or not someone is gay is whether or not they have a same-sex partner, more specifically a public, a visible same-sex partner. And that usually comes to the fore when they're getting married. And so it seems to me that the main reason why we have not had a ton of discrimination cases, and I'll grant you that we have not had the kind of totally widespread, ubiquitous discrimination against gay people by private businesses that we saw against black people in the Jim Crow South, just not on the same level. But it seems to me that one of the many reasons for that is that the first state to legalize gay marriage did so 10 years ago. And I think half a dozen did so just in the past year. The Federal Defense of Marriage Act was in force until this previous June. We just have not had gay marriage in this country for very long. It feels like it, to me at least, it feels like we've had it for ages. But we really have only seen the expansion of the last few years. It's a shock. It's a shock to many of us. And so I think that we will begin to see more of these cases. And I think that we have already begun to see more of these cases. And I think that, I mean, the florist, the baker, and the photographer, the infamous trio, are all very, very recent. And I think, and there are actually a few cases of bakers refusing to serve gay weddings. They happened in states that were about to or have only just legalized gay marriage. And I think that we're going to see, as we see an expansion of gay marriage across the United States, I think we're going to see an increasing amount of discrimination, or you can call it dissent or religious liberty, whatever you want to call it. We're going to see more and more businesses refusing to serve gay people, not because they've suddenly become homophobic, but because they suddenly have a fantastic way to tell whether or not someone is gay, which is that they're getting gay married. You know, that's a pretty good tell. I don't try to assume that someone is gay generally, but if they're getting gay married, it's usually a pretty good, pretty good odds. So
Yeah.
I think we are living in a country with 32 states that still ban gay marriage. And most of those bans passed with just shocking numbers by today's standards. 70%, 80% of voters in those states were totally happy to say, no, we will never, ever, ever have gay marriage here. And this was not all in 2004. Some of these bans are more recent. It seems very unlikely to me that if and when these bans start to fall, and I think they will fall fairly soon. They will probably all fall within the next few years if the Supreme Court gets another swing at it. I really think that we're going to start to see more people fighting back, and we're going to start seeing more instances like the baker, the florist, and the photographer who are saying, no, I am not happy with this, I am not okay with this, and deciding, I now know who's gay, and I'm not going to serve them. I'm not going to buy in to their orientation. I'm not going to legitimize it. Now, I think that it is a worthwhile effort to forestall that discrimination from occurring. Worthwhile, even though, as I completely admit, it has not been as ubiquitous as one might presume thus far. And I think that's because these things are just best nipped in the bud. And if you agree with the basic premise of anti-discrimination statutes as I have set them out, then it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, it is humiliating to be discriminated against on the basis of your identity, particularly on the basis of your sexual orientation. It is horrifying for your children to see it happen, for your family to see it happen. It is a terrible, terrible feeling. And I think that it's a pretty obvious and noble endeavor to try to prevent that from happening as much as possible. I mean, I keep thinking back in the photographer instance. I keep thinking back, what if those women had a child and they took the child into the photography store and the child had to hear the photographer say, certainly in courteous terms, I'm sorry, but because of who you are, I refuse to serve you. That is a shock that would stay with that child for the rest of her life. And I think it is an absolutely legitimate pursuit to give those women some kind of legal recourse.
Well, so a couple things. First, we certainly agree. We certainly agree that this kind of discrimination is terrible, and that many people experience humiliation when this happens, and that's terrible. I think, though, that I would say that about lots of different kinds of discrimination, right? So and lots of kinds of discrimination that both are and aren't protected. So I think it would be terrible, right, if someone went in and was refused service on the basis of their race. I think it would also be terrible if someone were, if a wedding photographer refused to take customers because one of them was morbidly obese, say, or because the photographer decided that she only wanted to photograph. She wouldn't photograph people if they fell below a certain threshold of perceived aesthetic attractiveness, right? That would be humiliating if someone went in and had that happen. At the same time, I don't want to make a law preventing that.
But obesity is not identity.
But again, the standard here is like, is it morally wrong to discriminate against someone on the basis of obesity? I would say, of course it is. Is it humiliating for that person who's experiencing it? I would say, of course it is. Should it be illegal? I don't think, if there were widespread discrimination of this sort, and it was causing obese people to not be able to find wedding vendors causing obese people to not be able to get hotel rooms or be served at restaurants, then I would say, yes, this is a problem. But like the reason I don't think obese people should have laws protecting them that are passed right now isn't because I think that it's okay. It isn't because I don't think it's horrifying. It's because I don't think that it is a problem to a degree that justifies passing laws about it. And this is the point I want to make about non-discrimination law, right? I don't want people to think of non-discrimination law as this thing where if you're allowed to discriminate against some group of people, some kind of people under the law, if there's no law against it, then what we're saying as a country is that discrimination against these kind of people is okay. That would be a terrible message for people to take because, in fact, it's legal to discriminate against all kinds of people in ways that would be morally odious, in ways that would be humiliating to the people involved, right? To me, non-discrimination law is a remedy that you use to protect terrible things from happening, right? Because ultimately, sorry, my video had a problem. Because non-discrimination law is something you use to protect terrible things from happening. It's something you use to make sure that a group or class of people isn't unable to live as social equals in the United States because the discrimination against them is so insidious and widespread that they can't live as equal citizens, right? I take a very practical view of non-discrimination law, right? In part because I understand the costs of non-discrimination law, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. But also because I don't want people who aren't protected by non-discrimination law to get the idea that discrimination against them is okay, whether they are, whether they're obese people or some other non-protected class, right? And I would guess that you agree that there are all kinds of discrimination that would be morally odious that shouldn't be actually illegal.
Right, but the criticism of non-discrimination laws as sort of gesturing to society, well, you can't discriminate against these people, but guess what? That means there's a whole bunch of other people you can discriminate against. It seems to me that argument could have been trotted out in 1964 as well. I'm not certain why it becomes more potent just because we are somewhat expanding the class of people against whom you can't discriminate.
Right, but in 1964, there would have been this powerful and decisive rebuttal, which was, no, we need non-discrimination law now for these very practical reasons, because all of these terrible things are happening all over the country, and it is making a whole huge class of the country unable to participate in equals, unable to succeed in life. It's consigning people to poverty. It's having all of these terrible consequences. That would have been the rebuttal in 1964 in a way that it would be very hard to make about wedding vendors in 2013 or 2014, right?
I suppose so, although I do think that over 40 states deciding that gay people are not permitted to get married would be some kind of discrimination, not on the scale of Jim Crow, but a discrimination loud enough to set off alarm bells.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, sort of on that point, I don't care for the analogy between gay people and obese people, because I think that gay people qualify as a protected class just sort of by American legal and constitutional standards in a way that obese people don't, because sexual orientation is much more of an identity marker than weight is, than obesity is. But if you take that example, I wonder if over 40 states passed laws saying that obese people were not permitted to get married, if 40 states were passed laws forbidding obese marriage and a subset of them also forbade obese people from adopting children, would that be enough discrimination for you to start considering passing non-discrimination ordinances? I mean, what is the threshold here for when non-discrimination ordinances are warranted?
Well, I mean, I think that preventing gay people from getting married is, in fact, insidious discrimination, and that laws should be passed everywhere guaranteeing them complete marriage equality and equality in every way that they interact with the state at all. I mean, it's like I want to address the insidious discrimination itself, not. I mean, there's a way in which um, there's a way in which you're not like if we were living in a society where they started banning obese people from getting married, that same society seemingly wouldn't pass laws protecting these people from discrimination because it would be a society that was insidiously discriminating against them. Um, so, uh, but maybe a different way to answer your question is like um, my threshold for non-discrimination law. Unfortunately, right, non-discrimination law um, is very limited in one sense. When that lesbian couple went to the photographer in New Mexico and said, "Will you photograph our wedding?" and she said no, right? Um, what they care about isn't really so much that she won't photograph their wedding. Like they found another photographer, that wasn't a problem, and they probably found a photographer who did a much better job than someone who doesn't um, herself think that gay unions are correct, right? Um,
Right.
what they care about is their perception that this person uh, has hateful feelings toward them. That was what they said. Um, Perhaps they might also care, right, that this person thinks that their marriage is invalid or sinful or whatever. And that non-discrimination law can't change that. Non-discrimination law can't change the heart or beliefs of that photographer. Uh, and it's terrible, right, that gay people ever have to deal with any kind of discrimination or in some cases any kind of hatefulness directed toward them. Non-discrimination law, though, can't change that. And I just think that, especially in cases where I thought the most powerful rebuttal to the New Mexico Human Rights Commission and the New Mexico Supreme Court was written by Eugene Volokh, who's a UCLA professor, and was basically saying that, and I think that this is kind of where I come down on this, that it would be one thing if a hotel were to refuse to rent a room to any people after their gay wedding, right? If the Hilton chain decided we won't rent rooms to anyone who is celebrating a gay marriage, right? That would be one thing. It's quite another thing for a photographer or a cake maker, right? These are the cases that people are getting because, and I think actually the cake maker is a much weaker claim, but with the photographer, this is in a sense First Amendment intellectual activity, right? That we're asking this photographer to do in this case, that the Human Rights Commission would compel her to do or punish her with a fine for not doing, right? If you would all believe that photography is an intellectual creative enterprise and that photographs are First Amendment protected speech, non-discrimination law is coming into pretty direct conflict with a fundamental freedom here in a way that I would argue has some pretty alarming possible consequences in the precedent that it sets.
So two responses. The first would just be, I don't think that non-discrimination laws are necessarily designed or must change hearts and minds in order to be successful. I think they need only change interactions. That's sort of a low bar to clear. I don't think that someone who's told they aren't permitted to discriminate against black people at their restaurant needs to then fully change their, white supremacist beliefs in order to truly comply with that non-discrimination ordinance.
Yeah, I agree with
all
that.
they have to do is serve black people. Very, very simple.
Uh-huh.
The second point, though, is the photography case is way more interesting to me than the baker and florist case. I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
It is just on a different level. And when I first read about the case, I was pretty ambivalent about it. And I have to say that on the First Amendment claim, I remain somewhat ambivalent, though I think that I do fall in the camp that I have fallen in and written about
Yeah.
extensively. So Eugene Volokh, generally a pretty strong First Amendment supporter. I must say, as a side
Yes.
note, that when he came out on the wrong side of the United States versus Alvarez case and said that the government can criminalize lies, that I lost some First Amendment respect for him. But he knows what he's talking about in general. And he makes a very strong case that photography is an artistic pursuit, that photography is a form of intellectual activity that might potentially fall under the First Amendment's ambit. Now, it's worth noting that at this stage, the Supreme Court has not decided that photography is in any way protected by the First Amendment. It's never gone up to the Supreme Court, so we're all sort of dealing in conjecture here. But if you take as a given the idea that photography does merit some First Amendment protections, I'm still just not entirely sold on Volokh's thesis, which is that because it qualifies for some First Amendment protections, that as soon as someone picks up a camera, that they, can throw off any and all regulations, particularly non-discrimination regulations, because they're engaging in speech. I think that the government could never tell a private photographer, oh, look at that gay couple over there, you need to take a picture of them. The government could never tell me that if I don't take at least 6 pictures of gay couples with my camera phone every day, that I will go to jail. But when a person picks up a camera and does so in the capacity as a professional photographer, when she throws open her doors and says, come one, come all, I'm a photographer and I'm going to serve you, the public, then it seems to me that it sort of reverts back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that she is taking these pictures in her capacity as a professional. She is running a business. And so from the business end of things, she's not permitted to, again, sort through different classes of people and expel the ones that she's not a fan of. But I do think that there's an interesting First Amendment discussion here. Actually, I personally think the First Amendment discussion is the most interesting point of all of this.
So before we close, I guess I want to talk a little bit more about what I view as the costs of non-discrimination law. And, as I was going through hypotheticals earlier and kind of asking you what your views were, I think one of the instances where you said that under your understanding, a gay photographer would probably be compelled to take photographs of an Orthodox Christian wedding, despite powerful theological differences with the Catholic Church, or perhaps even a sect, perhaps even a different religious group that had even stronger views about gays. Believed that gays should be immediately killed or something, right? And even that religious belief wouldn't save this photographer because if we're treating religion as a protected class. I think that this is one example, right, of the heavy costs that can be imposed on individual, whether it's business owners or people, depending on how widely you apply non-discrimination law. But we can stick with business owners. This is like a really significantly heavy cost, right? So if we have this example of the Orthodox Catholic couple and the gay photographer who doesn't want to take their picture, it seems to me that the Orthodox Catholic couple bears very little cost if this, arbitrary photographer decides not to take their picture, right? They can easily find another photographer in practice. We can imagine a society, right, where lots of photographers started deciding that they didn't want to photograph Orthodox Christian weddings, but we don't actually live in that society. The society we actually live in is one where finding another photographer would be very easy, would impose very little cost. Forcing the photographer would impose very heavy costs on the photographer. So why come down that way?
Well, so I think that we need to step back a little bit, and when we're talking about the costs of either side of the situation, just picture the town where there's only one photographer, there's only one there's only one florist, for instance, and
Uh-huh.
this photographer, this florist, says to the gay couple getting married, "I absolutely refuse to serve you. I'm not going to. You'll have to go somewhere else." One can
Mhm.
imagine all kinds of indignities that could come from that. Um, what are you defining as a cost here? Are you talking about societal cost, monetary cost, the cost of liberty?
No, I'm just talking about the two sets of individuals involved in any non-discrimination case, right? You have
Okay,
the person being discriminated against, and you have the person who wants to do the discrimination and either is or isn't allowed. And
right.
there's like infinite examples that we could come up with, infinite hypotheticals. But I would just say we can certainly think, no matter what class of people you want to protect, right? You can think of examples that would impose heavy costs on either side. And you can think of
Okay,
hypotheticals where we would be sympathetic to one person or the other, right? And
right.
so by that, I don't mean to suggest that there should never be non-discrimination laws. Clearly, I think that they are justified in lots of different circumstances. I would just say that there is this heavy cost that comes with them, and we should therefore think carefully of when we want to impose these heavy costs, and we should do it when there is a actual and pressing problem, not a hypothetical possible problem sometime in the future, because the costs that will be imposed are actual, not hypothetical and future.
I'm not sure that they're that heavy. I mean, it seems to me that we as a society have decided, like as a general proposition,
Uh-huh.
whether you look at it in particular cases, as a general proposition, that non-discrimination laws are good. That non-discrimination laws are a noble pursuit. The cost of that in the 1960s was that people who really hated black people had to serve them at their restaurants and lunch counters and hotels. The cost of that throughout the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s
Mhm.
is that businesses, some colleges had to allow women in, even though they thought that women were, you name it, weak, inferior, whatever.
Mhm.
And we sort of decided that it would be acceptable for us to demand that people swallow those costs, that people say, I'm going to have to follow the law here. I'm going to have to let black people into my restaurant. I'm going to have to let women into my college.
Yeah.
I don't see why the gay example is so different in kind. And I also wonder if your argument doesn't work in both directions. I mean, you've said that because there hasn't been a rash of anti-gay discrimination cases that we might reconsider whether these ordinances are worth it. But wouldn't that also mean that there are so few that it's actually not that heavy a cost, that it is worth having them around for the few isolated instances when we see real,
Yeah.
honest to goodness anti-gay discrimination?
Well, so I would say actually that the gender example is maybe a useful one to explore a little bit more because as a general proposition, I am supportive. Uh, so on race and gender and sometimes sexual orientation, right? When I think that non-discrimination law should be applied in these cases, it's not because I have some abstract notion that non-discrimination law is a noble pursuit. It's because I believe that the particulars of the situation mean that applying non-discrimination law solves all kinds of insidious problems that would go on otherwise, that the costs far outweigh the benefits. Or I'm sorry, that the benefits far outweigh the costs of non-discrimination law in these individual cases. And but I don't think, right, that as a society we're forced to either protect a class of people in every instance so that there's never any discrimination that can occur, or to not offer them any protection, right? And so, like I was saying before, I would certainly protect gays from an ambulance company who would not pick them up. Um, uh, I would not protect them from the New Mexico photographer, right? And and again, that kind of touches on these complicated First Amendment issues as well. But when we think about men and women, for example, and forced integration, forced non-discrimination, right? Should a law firm be allowed to not hire any women employees? No, I'm fine with non-discrimination laws that prevent that kind of thing, right? Um, on the other hand, there are some kinds of discrimination, gender discrimination, that I'm perfectly fine with. And to give you an example, do I think that there should be allowed to be women's professional sports leagues that exclude men and that have competition only among women. Yeah, totally. Do I think that they should be allowed to have, you know, uh, an all girls elementary school? Should that be allowed to exist in society? Yes, that is discrimination, and it's an instance where I don't know what your feelings on these issues are, but society as a whole, despite its general support for non-discrimination laws protecting male and female equality, recognizes that if we were to actually go all the way and impose absolute non-discrimination, this would impose heavy costs. And actually, we can have finer grained distinctions to, uh, to impose less costs while still protecting the things we really care about.
Well, you could also just draw a bright line between completely private organizations and businesses and groups open to the public, which is what I think would be the distinction here. I mean, in all women's private college they're completely private. They don't open themselves up to the public. They're exclusive. They're selective, as compared to, for instance, a state school. I think you can draw a pretty bright line there. The same thing goes for sports clubs. The same thing goes for private clubs. I mean, this has been an exception to non-discrimination ordinances forever and for always. I mean, there are still country clubs in the South that don't let Jews in, and that's completely fine. The difference between the baker and the private country club is that one of them opens the doors to the public and says, you are hereby on notice, I want you to buy my products, and one of them closes their doors and says, you are hereby on notice that we're only letting a select few people in and we get to discriminate however we want.
Right, but this is you're right. You're describing the way that we've set things up, right? But it seems to me, so I'm far more horrified by a private country club that won't let Jews in because, I can't think of any reason that would not strike me as morally outrageous, right?
We're too noisy. That's the problem.
So, on one hand, we have this case where I can't think of something I'm less sympathetic to. I'm certainly much more sympathetic to the New Mexico photographer who generally serves gay people, who I think, although you disagree, doesn't have hatred toward gay people in her heart, doesn't have any desire for gay people to be excluded from society generally, but has these particular religious beliefs about marriage that cause her to act in this way. So, I understand the general public-private distinction. I understand why this has come into being in law. I would just say that just because these are the laws that we operate under generally doesn't mean that in any particular situation the outcomes are necessarily what we would want them to be.
I think the problem here is the analog, which is my error. I should not have compared the private club to the photographer, but really compared the private club to a restaurant. Say a restaurant by the side of the road that performs a similar function as the private club, serving food. Do you think that it would be okay for a state to mandate that the restaurant that is seemingly open to the public must serve all customers, even if they're gay couples?
I'm fine. I'm fine as a general principle. Like if gay people were getting excluded from roadside restaurants on a regular basis, then I would be fine with that kind of protection.
And what if they're not? What if there's only one reported incident of it? A gay family walks into a restaurant and the host says, "I'm sorry, but I believe you're living in sin and I refuse to seat you." What would be the remedy there?
I do not think that we should pass federal laws as remedies for individual, literally one situation that's unjust.
What about a municipal law?
Is this like an ongoing thing?
No, but there is a small town, and it's widely known that there are a few restaurants in this hypothetical whose hosts refuse to seat gay people, and the town council decides to pass an anti-discrimination ordinance that no restaurants may discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I haven't thought a ton about this, so tentatively, yeah, I think that would be fine.
So is it the scope of the law that bothers you? Is it federal versus state law versus municipal law? Is that what's sort of rankling you about this law? The New Mexico law is too broad because it's on a state level, but a county level anti-discrimination
Okay,
law would be okay?
here's what is here's what I object to, right? Um, if you pass an all-encompassing discrimination law, non-discrimination law in this case, right, that includes gay marriage, um, then this imposes various costs, right? One cost is on people like the New Mexico photographer, uh, who faces this choice between get fined by the state or violate my conscience and do what I regard as something that would consign me to hell, right? That I would argue is a pretty heavy cost. Another cost is just the general non-discrimination law can be problematic insofar as it's like it's what it's making illegal is in some ways like thought and motivation, right? So the New Mexico photographer, in other words, could have said, no, I don't like the aesthetics of your wedding, right? Or no, I don't like the, I just don't get along with you as a person, and I don't want to spend time with you that would be necessary to photograph your wedding, right? And obviously that can't be a get out free card, right? Like if a restaurant was turning away black people and finding a pretext to do so, you would rightfully have a lawsuit where they would argue, look at this pattern of behavior that you're exhibiting and, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it invites all kinds of litigation in hard gray cases where you're trying to figure out what is the motivation of this person who discriminated. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with laws that are in some way like trying to probe people's thoughts and figure out what's actually going on. So I would just argue that doesn't mean we shouldn't have non-discrimination laws. It's a cost of them that just like adds in the cost column, and it doesn't mean that the costs are never worth the benefits. I would argue also that the more classes that you protect with non-discrimination laws, you run into this problem that I was talking about before, where there's always other unprotected classes, and you don't want to send a signal in general that non-discrimination law is banning all immoral discrimination, because there's always going to be lots of kinds of discrimination that are terrible and that people shouldn't have to go through that are legal. For all these reasons, right, I only want to have non-discrimination laws when there is a demonstrated problem, and that it's going to help fix this problem. I want a very practical approach to these things, where if some class of people is being unjustly excluded from social equality in America, I want non-discrimination laws to come in and to help them. And when I figure out when I want these non-discrimination laws to apply, I look at the cost to the people, and I look at, in practice, how the remedies will turn out. So in the case of gays with an ambulance company that won't take them, the cost is huge. They could die on the street, right? And the cost to this ambulance company, the guy's driving the ambulance and there's a gay person in the back, the cost isn't very big. There's no religion that says you're going to go to hell if you drive a gay person in an ambulance to the hospital. In fact, quite the contrary, right? So that seems to me like an easy case. The wedding photographer seems to me like a case where I don't think it's as easy as the ambulance, but when I weigh the costs and the benefits, it seems like it should come out where, given the fact that this isn't an existing problem in America on any kind of like widespread level, I just come out the other way.
I guess I perform a similar equation and just come out on the different side. It seems to me that when you have 32 states that still actively ban gay marriage and a number of states that ban gay adoption, that you do have a problem of discrimination, and that one of the only reasons that it hasn't trickled down yet into very widespread private discrimination is that there just haven't been many opportunities for it. Because up until this last few years, really, gay people have not been public about their orientation, have not been public about their sexuality. Many gay people were still in the closet, in the glass closet. So we're starting to see much more public facet to gay life. And with it, we're starting to see more and more cases crop up, like the florist, the baker, and the photographer. And it worries me. And so I think that it seems worthwhile to me because it's not widespread yet, but it's certainly not merely in the realm of a hypothetical. I also probably don't weigh the cost the same way. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to me, there were and remain many people who believe that interracial marriage was sinful, not just wrong or disgusting, but biblically wrong, morally wrong. And I'm not certain why the cost of forcing someone still to serve an interracial couple is less than the cost of forcing someone to serve a gay couple. But I do know that you have this broader point about non-discrimination laws against blacks, so I won't probe that. We don't need to have that conversation again. But I mean, I think I do perform a similar equation. And to me, it seems like a problem that is present, a problem that is escalating, and a problem that is not too cost heavy for us to go ahead and deal with now before waiting until it's too late.
Yeah, and this is an actual, and maybe this could be our last point because we've gone pretty long. But so this is actually another thing that we can isolate and talk about, I think, because when I do a forward-looking analysis, I kind of come to an opposite conclusion. I very much share your desire to have a country where gay people are discriminated against as little as possible, and I think that there are all kinds of remedies other than non-discrimination law by which this can be achieved. Like whether or not we have a non-discrimination law, persuasion should be an active thing that is happening. And I think that social norms and social shaming should come into play. I think that, in all kinds of cases, the right outcome when a business owner refuses to serve someone is, like I don't want to patronize a wedding photographer who won't serve gays, and I wouldn't do so. And that itself is both signals people saying no, this is wrong, and is also a practical inducement to not have these practices and to not have them be widespread. Now, my read on social trends is that in a very rapid way, acceptance of gays and lesbians is spreading, and discrimination against them is narrowing. I absolutely agree that it's urgent that gays be allowed to marry and adopt with equality everywhere, and I would tackle those problems by actually tackling those problems themselves. But my read on what will happen if these non-discrimination laws pass and we see more instances of the photographer and the baker and whatnot, I kind of think that the practical consequences of this will be bad for gays and lesbians, because I think that in these narrow circumstances, right, where you have so that there's kind of a lot of fights going on like this right now with the contraceptive mandate, right, and religious groups saying you're forcing us to violate our conscience, and the same thing is happening with these gay marriage cases. Religious groups are saying you're forcing us to violate our conscience in this narrow area where we have strong beliefs. To me, the practical consequences going forward are like, if you carve out a little exception for gay marriage in particularly, like not discriminating against gay people generally, but gay marriage in particular, and people serving gay weddings in particular, then you avoid a whole lot of fights where a whole lot of the country feels like it's wrong to force these people to violate their consciences. And because of this, you have a lot more opposition to the wider realm of non-discrimination laws than you would otherwise have. To me, if you carve out this exception, then what happens going forward is that society every year gets more and more friendly to gays. And I actually think that that's going to happen either way. But I think that you dramatically increase the resistance if it seems as if what's happening is that anyone, like to put it in the frame of the Russ Dalton column that I know you disagree with, if it seems as though the people who are negotiating cultural surrender are kind of being hounded into like being fined when they refuse to violate their conscience, that's going to create a backlash. And that I think it will create a backlash, I acknowledge doesn't bear on the merits of the case, but I'm just saying, you were saying practically speaking, you think that this will help. I think practically speaking, it will be a hindrance, and that it would be bad in the long term for the cause of diminishing the divide between gay people and those straight people who are still uneasy with gay marriage.
I'm not certain I agree with the central proposition, which I think is essentially that if we allow people to discriminate against gays, that there will be less discrimination against gays. I don't think that really clicks with me. And I
Well,
also think
that's not exactly how I put it. I think if we allow people to not participate in gay marriage as an institution, if we allow people to not directly participate in gay marriage as an institution, then that will help the process of diffusing the culture war between gays and religious people.
Okay, I mean, I can see that argument. I think I could take that same proposition and sort of turn it on its face and say, well, if the government continues to tell people, listen, it's legally permissible for you to not recognize gay marriage, not serve gay couples, continue to discriminate against gay people, that it will become more of a sort of self-fulfilling proposition. The government tells you that you're allowed to do it, so then you do it. And that the government using a guiding hand to tell people, people in New Mexico, for instance, no, you're not permitted to discriminate against gay people. We'll clue people into to see, oh, I'm not allowed to, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it's best not to turn gay people away, not to turn gay couples away.
Yeah.
But I guess we're both functioning, I guess we're both sort of in the realm of conjecture at this point. We just don't know. I mean, my concern is when the court strikes down state-level gay marriage bans next term or the term after, what happens in places like Texas? What happens in places like Mississippi? Do we see a backlash like we saw after Brown v. Board? Do we see people sort of transferring their bigotry or animus from opposition to marriage to opposition to, gay people, serving gay people? Do we see private businesses saying, well, I guess the Supreme Court got us on gay marriage, but we can still make sure we express our disapproval of gay people? And does that animus transfer from the marriage realm into a bunch of other arenas of life? And I guess we just don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't. And if I turn out to be wrong, and you do start to see this kind of animus poking up in insidious ways, then I will join you in advocating some kind of federal response to protect the social equality of gay people in these states. But hopefully you'll be wrong on this. And
yes, I will say that. I do hope that I am wrong. Actually, I do hope that we don't see more animus.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a good conversation. Thanks for coming on. And unless you have anything else to add, I will give you the last word, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Oh yeah, no, I have no last word. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad we could agree to disagree and have so much fun doing it.
All right, indeed. Have a good day.